It feels to me that when I'm going to deliver a sermon that is entirely out of sync with public conversation and thought, that I almost need to quote Lewis Carroll's famous poem in Through the Looking Glass. The time has come, the walrus said, to talk of many things, of shoes and ships and sealing wax, of cabbages and kings, and why the sea is boiling hot, and whether pigs have wings. It's actually not all that uncommon for me to take my Sunday morning time to offer my answers to questions that absolutely no one has ever asked me. But today I may be wandering more into the comparison of two things that are as different as cabbages and kings, but which may be related in oddly disturbing ways. You know, we never get to finish one election before the talking heads on the 24-hour news cycle insist upon constantly speculating about the next election. At present, it seems to be nearly unavoidable that Joe Biden will run for re-election in 2024 when he is 82 years old. And if Donald Trump manages to secure the Republican nomination again, he will be 78 years old on Election Day. Bernie Sanders will be 83, but I know that none of you want to hear me talk about him anymore. But 78 and 82 are pretty old, older than any presidential candidates of the past. But how old is too old? No one asked me in 2020 if Biden was too old then, but if you had asked me, I would have replied that he certainly was. He's 10 years older than I am, and I know that I'm too old to take on anything that would make me have to put in 50 or 60 hours of productive work every week and would frequently keep me from taking an afternoon nap. However, I think that we can all say that had you asked me in 2020 about Biden's age, that I would have been wrong. Go ahead and mark that down in your calendar. As history has dealt its cards to us in the past 2 years, with a hot war in Europe and the threat of an invasion of Taiwan by China, Biden's decades of experience in foreign policy have been crucial. In fact, I don't know who would have been better prepared to have been in the White House for these past 2 years than him. He isn't a genius, he isn't a scholar, and he is a horrible public speaker, and he is an absolute gaffe machine. But I and a whole lot of other people have underestimated him over and over and over again. I can say in all humility that I'm glad that we have had his wrinkled hand on the rudder these past 2 years. When a football quarterback is still on the field at 40 years old, that's national news. When Serena Williams announced that she was retiring from tennis, people talked about her being 41 years old as if she were ancient. But we're contemplating giving the nuclear football to a guy who would be 86 years old when he finished his second term. I'm not saying that he can't do it, but I'm 66 and my daughter won't let me eat on her sofa anymore. I'm just saying. Now, you know how I feel. Trump's not qualified to manage a hot dog stand in his 70s, and I doubt that he would have been any better at it when he was younger. But it should be apparent that Biden had skills in his 70s that he would not have had in his 30s or 40s. There are things that people only learn through decades of experience. Our culture tends to worship youth, beauty, vitality, and to put it plainly, hotness. But most of life is not about being sexy. Sometimes what we need is wisdom and experience. Early in December, the New York Times published an opinion piece by David Wallace Wells that takes a very honest look at a neglected truth of the COVID pandemic. We all started to act like the pandemic was over several months ago. Almost no one wears a mask anywhere anymore, not even in crowded Christmas shopping department stores, but we still have 300 people dying every day from COVID. Every day, 10,000 people a month. COVID is the third leading cause of death in America, and we act like it's over. Last January, President Biden said that COVID had largely become a pandemic of the unvaccinated. And while being unvaccinated certainly increases your chances of either getting COVID or dying from it, the truth is, the hard truth is, that most of the people who are dying of COVID daily are vaccinated. It's just that 90% of the deaths are among people who are 65 and older. An 80-year-old who is vaccinated and boosted has a greater risk of dying from COVID than a 70-year-old who's never been vaccinated. Age has always been a huge factor in the lethal risk of COVID, but it has become more so as the months have gone by. I've lately crossed the line. I am now over 65. I've been vaccinated. I've had 4 booster shots. There are lab rats at Pfizer-BioNTech that haven't had as many vaccine jabs as I have had. But I got COVID twice. I got a flu shot. And for the first time in my life, I had the flu. The vaccines may have kept me out of the hospital, but they sure didn't keep me on the racquetball court. Which raises the question of whether we should have been so concerned about getting air purifiers in our schools when it was really the people living in nursing facilities who were the most likely to die. I understand that we reflexively value the lives of the young more than we do the lives of the elderly, but I'm saying that the lives of senior citizens also have value. David Wallace Wells reminds us in his article that the conservative commentator Ben Shapiro, as well as the Lieutenant Governor of Texas, Dan Patrick, simply waved off the risk of the pandemic in early 2020 because only senior citizens were at risk, only people like me. As if any one of these 1 million deaths do not really matter because those people were going to die anyway, they said. Well, folks, here's the hard fact. The mortality rate is 100% because even children are gonna die anyway. But just because you may only have a decade of life left does not mean that your life is without value. Consider this. Martin Luther King was 26 years old when he completed his doctorate in theology from Boston University. He was the pastor at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, and he had been hired by Dexter Avenue when they accepted the resignation of his predecessor, Vernon Johns. Vernon Johns was always in trouble with some of his members because he was so politically active and so outspoken that he regularly offered his resignation to force them to make a decision. And the 5th time he offered his resignation, he was shocked by the fact that they accepted it. King was hired with the solemn injunction to stick to the Bible and stay out of politics. But 6 months later, after he'd been awarded his doctorate, some housekeeper in Montgomery, Rosa Parks, refused to give up her seat on a bus to a white man and moved to the back of the bus. Now, that was not an accident. Rosa Parks had been preparing for some kind of civil rights protest for a long time, but no one thought it would be that day, and it had nothing to do with Martin Luther King. But a few days later, when leaders of black congregations in Montgomery gathered to discuss how to use the public furor over Rosa Parks' arrest, King didn't even plan to go to the meeting, but a friend called him and talked him into going, but he had an infant child and a wife at home that he was reticent to leave. But at the meeting, the older pastors, I know if you've never been in a clergy meeting, this might come as a surprise to you, but pastors are very competitive. We call it steeple envy, that pastors are jealous of the notoriety of other people in their peer group. So they all finally agreed that they would take Martin Luther King, who was a young nobody, and push him up to be the spokesperson of their decision to protest the bus rules and segregation in Montgomery. Everything you know about Martin Luther King Jr., all of his speeches, all the marches, all of the books he wrote, the Nobel Peace Prize, everything you know about him took place in the next 12 years, and he was murdered on April 4th, 1968, when he was 39 years old. It never ceases to amaze me that one of the most influential preachers in history would not be old enough to even be considered to be hired by most prominent congregations today. But by contrast, if you look at the timeline of Mahatma Gandhi's life, though Gandhi protested racial discrimination in Great Britain and began writing and discerning his ultimate mission of liberation of India earlier in his life, his real public notoriety came when he led the famous Salt March in 1930, and he was 61 years old. His imprisonments, protests, books, demonstrations continued for the next 17 years until India was given autonomy when Gandhi was 78 years old. If Gandhi had been 39 when he was assassinated instead of 78, none of us would have ever heard of Gandhi. If King had lived to be 78, who knows what he might have done? There are things that only the young can do, but there are things that call for age and experience. Ben Franklin was 70 when he signed the Declaration of Independence. Nelson Mandela was 76 when he emerged from prison to be elected president of South Africa. Mother Teresa was 69 when she won the Nobel Peace Prize. The young and the healthy may choose to live as if things like COVID or the flu offer no real threat to them, but even if they have no reason to fear infection for themselves, they live in a world in which we can be thankful for the contributions of people like Gandhi or Biden or Mother Teresa, and thank God no one infected them through their carelessness and indifference. We are all connected, and we all will eventually be old if something doesn't kill us first. People are sometimes shocked when I remind them that the mortality rate is still what it has always been, 100%. But none other than John Donne said it first, albeit rather more elegantly, in his famous poem, "No man is an island, entire of itself. Each is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod is washed away by the sea, Europe is that much less. As well as if a promontory were, as well as if a manor of thine own or thine friends were, each man's death diminishes me. For I am involved in mankind. Therefore sin not to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee."
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.